welcome to the deep dive.
Hello, great to be here.
So this is where we take a whole pile of sources, really, and try to extract the most, well, fascinating bits of knowledge just for you, our listener.
Yeah, think of it as a shortcut, maybe. Trying to get you clued in on some perhaps surprising ideas without totally drowning you in information.
Exactly. No overwhelm here. And today we're diving into something pretty unique. Vedic physics.
Hmm.
We're mainly using the book Introduction to Vedic Physics by Vishal Arya. But it's important to know this book is actually a summary.
Right. It distills a much, much larger work, Vaid Vigyan Alok, by Acharya Agniratji Nashtik.
It's quite a lineage there. And our goal, our mission for this deep dive, it's really to understand the fundamental ideas of Vedic physics as laid out in this book.
And crucially, to see how these ideas stack up against or maybe align with modern scientific understanding. We want to get at the core insights.
We also want to look at not just the how, but the why and the for whom, which seems to be a big theme in this Vedic approach.
Absolutely. And we know you, our listener, you might be coming from anywhere in terms of technical background.
Yeah, so we promise to keep it clear, keep it engaging, hopefully spark some aha moments, without getting bogged down in jargon.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's crack open this book, Introduction to Vedic Physics. Right at the start, there's a dedication.
Yeah, to scientific geniuses and young brains, which is a nice, encouraging way to begin, I think. Sets a tone of inquiry.
It does. And then we immediately hit the foreword by Dr. Bhuvah Singh. He gives some really important context straight away.
He does. He highlights that Vishal Arya's book is summarizing Acharya Agniratji Nashtik's huge work.
Which, as Dr. Singh points out, is a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
Summarizing something that complex, not easy.
Definitely not. And Dr. Singh offers a key idea, almost a lens to view the whole thing through. He talks about the cause-effect theory.
Right. But with three specific causes. You've got the material cause, the Ipat Karan, the instrumental cause, Nimitta Karan, and a helping cause, Sahayak Karan. He suggests this three-cause framework is fundamental to understanding everything the book explains, from tiny, subtle stuff right up to the cosmos.
That's a really interesting starting point, isn't it? Because it immediately suggests a different way of thinking about causality compared to how modern science often frames it.
It really does. And that leads into another major point he makes, contrasting the focus of science.
Yeah, he points out that modern science often drills down really hard on the how, the mechanisms, the processes.
But Vedic science, according to this perspective, aims for more. It wants to answer how, sure, but also why and for whom.
Which is a fascinating distinction. The argument presented is that this more complete understanding, this inclusion of purpose and beneficiary, might actually make the knowledge less prone to misuse.
That's a big claim. The idea that completeness inherently includes an ethical safeguard.
It is. Dr. Bhuvah Singh even suggests that embracing Vedic science could have massive benefits, not just for humans, but for the whole planet, the whole ecosystem. What do you make of that emphasis on why and for whom right at the outset?
Well, it immediately forces you to think about the ethical side of things, doesn't it? Modern science pushes for objectivity, which is crucial, of course.
Of course.
But adding the why and for whom brings in this layer of purpose, of consequence, that maybe isn't always front and center in, say, fundamental physics research.
Yeah.
The idea that it guards against misuse is, well, it's definitely food for thought.
It really raises questions about the responsibility that comes with knowledge, doesn't it? We also hear about a scientist in Sweden.
Ah, yes.
Someone with a standard modern science background who apparently found that Vaid Vigyan Alok offered some potential answers to big global challenges, things like climate change, even the origin of the universe.
And the key seemed to be that it considered both living and non-living aspects together, like a more integrated view.
Exactly. It hints at this possibility of a more holistic approach, perhaps bridging gaps that modern science sometimes struggles with.
Interesting. Then there's another foreword, this one from someone at J.K. Lakshmipat University.
Right, and they position this book, Introduction to Vedic Physics, as really unique, a first of its kind, based on something called the Vedic Rashmi theory.
Okay, Vedic Rashmi theory. That sounds important.
It seems to be central. It's presented as Agnivrataji's proposal, developed after years of really deep work on a specific ancient text, the Aitareya Brahman.
And this Rashmi theory, it's not just a minor idea. It apparently systematically explains the creation of the whole universe.
That's the claim. And importantly, it's presented as an alternative to the Big Bang theory.
Wow, okay. So it's directly engaging with and challenging the dominant cosmological model. That's ambitious.
It certainly is. It's not just offering little insights here and there, but a whole different cosmological narrative rooted in these ancient texts and this Rashmi theory.
And it's not just the super big picture cosmology stuff either, is it? The forward mentions it also gets into the nitty-gritty.
Exactly, like the nature of photons, elementary particles, how they absorb and emit energy.
Which are definitely hot topics in modern physics research right now. Quantum mechanics, particle physics.
Precisely. The suggestion is that Vedic physics might offer insights into these really fundamental areas. There's also a fascinating point made about observation.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that to see really subtle things, your probe, your tool needs to be even subtler.
That resonates, doesn't it? Especially with the way things are going in quantum tech, trying to measure things at incredibly tiny scales.
It feels very relevant, yeah. It's almost like an ancient echo of a modern challenge.
The foreword also gives a quick glimpse of the book's chapters. It covers a huge range.
It really does. Mass and its cause, quanta, how stars form, electromagnetic waves.
And even something called Mahapralaya, which is described as the absolute dissolution of the cosmos.
Yeah, the ultimate end state. So it really attempts to paint a picture of the entire cosmic cycle, from creation to dissolution, a complete system.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Let's move into the core principles themselves. The book starts with the Vedic view of the Veda itself.
Right. It's presented not just as an old text, but as knowledge that's as old as intelligent life, basically. Universal knowledge.
And the idea is that the mantras within the Veda, their vibrations, they actually produce the cosmos.
That's the concept. And this creation is attributed to a Satana Sattva.
A supreme conscious entity.
Exactly, which right away is a fundamentally different starting point than, say, the Big Bang model, which doesn't invoke consciousness as the primary cause. What's your first reaction to that idea?
Well, it immediately throws a huge philosophical component into the mix, doesn't it? Something largely absent from the standard scientific story of origins. A conscious creator is a massive departure from purely material explanations.
It is. And to support this connection between the Veda and the cosmos, the book brings in a concept called Tatu Samanvayaka from the Brahma Sutra.
Tatu Samanvayata. What does that mean exactly?
It basically means perfect coordination or harmony. The idea is that the knowledge in the Veda perfectly mirrors the structure and functioning of the universe. They are inherently aligned.
Okay. And it goes even further, suggesting that all language, all knowledge, originally came from this Vedic source.
That's the claim, leading to this idea of a golden age, Jagadguru Pharat, a world prosperous because it had this true understanding, until, supposedly, misunderstandings crept in and the knowledge got distorted or lost.
So there's a whole historical and cultural narrative wrapped up in this too.
Very much so. And then building on that comes a critique of modern science.
Ah, okay. How does it critique it?
The argument is that by ignoring this conscious entity, by focusing only on the material, modern science fails to grasp the totality of the cosmos.
And the consequence of that incomplete view
Is potentially harmful. Uncontrolled innovations, technologies developed without understanding the full context, including the why and for whom.
So, the critique is that modern science isn't just incomplete, it's potentially dangerous because of that incompleteness. That's quite a strong statement.
It is. And tied to this is the Vedic view of what science is. It's seen as unchangeable truth.
Unchangeable. How so?
The idea is if our understanding changes, it just means we didn't have the full picture to begin with. True science, in this view, doesn't get revised.
That's a stark contrast to the modern scientific method, which is all about testing, refining, revising theories based on new evidence, constant change is built in.
A very different philosophy of knowledge, yeah. And wrapping up this introductory part, Acharya Agnavratneshthik expresses a hope.
What's the hope?
That this book, this knowledge, will offer a new path for understanding the universe, but also, interestingly, instill a kind of national self-respect by revealing what he sees as the true original science.
Okay, but he adds a clarification about that, doesn't he?
Yes. Importantly, he clarifies that this Vedic perspective promotes universal brotherhood, not, nationalism in an aggressive sense or opposing others without reason.
That seems like an important nuance. And his final piece of advice.
It's basically to read the book with an open mind. Put aside prejudices and actively compare the facts presented with modern science.
That call for open comparison feels crucial. It invites critical engagement, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It sets the stage for a dialogue, even if it's just in the reader's mind, between these two potentially very different ways of understanding reality. So this whole intro really maps out the core philosophical divide.
It really does. Origin, consciousness, the nature of science itself. Okay, let's dive into some of the key concepts now, starting with that Vedic Rashmi theory and something called Vak.
Right, so Vak. The book explains the cosmos starts with the very first vibration. It's called Paravak.
Paravak. And this comes from
From the conscious entity acting within the fundamental causal material, which is called Prakriti.
Okay, so consciousness vibrating within primordial matter. And this Vak isn't static.
No, it transforms. It goes through stages. Para, which is the most subtle, then Pashanti, Madhyama, and finally Vaikari. This whole process links consciousness to the material world.
They use an analogy, right? A microphone and loudspeaker. How does that help explain it?
Yeah, it's quite a neat analogy. Think of the conscious entity's initial impulse, the unmanifest thought, as Paravak.
Okay.
As it starts to take form, becoming perceivable maybe just to consciousness itself, that's Pashanti, like the microphone picking up the intent. Madhyama is like the internal processing, the signal within the system, the mental conceptualization.
Right.
And Vaikari is the final output, the sound from the loudspeaker, the manifested speech, or in this case, the manifested physical reality. Parkari is the medium allowing this whole process.
That does help visualize it. And then there's Vijnana, which is translated as science here. How is that defined?
It's defined quite broadly, actually. It's the wise use of jnana, knowledge, karma, action, and upasana, which is like contemplation or worship.
Wise use. For what purpose?
To get true knowledge about the entire cosmos. From the supreme being all the way down to basic matter. And there's a crucial ethical component built in. That any knowledge leading to harm simply isn't true science.
Wow. So science inherently has to be beneficial in this view. That ethical dimension is really woven in, isn't it?
Deeply woven in. It's not an afterthought. It's part of the definition.
Okay. Then we have Padartha, or Tattva. What does that refer to?
Simply put, it means material or reality, basically anything that has existence.
And from that definition, the book immediately asks the big question. What's the fundamental cause of all this existing stuff, the cosmos?
And the Vedic answer is clear. It's not random chance. It's presented as an intelligent design.
An intelligent design. Meaning?
Meaning a very specific, intricate combination of subtle entities, all governed by fixed principles and laws. There's an underlying order. The book even brings in Richard Feynman.
Feynman, how does he fit in?
With his analogy of the universe being like a grand chess game played by gods. The idea being, we might not know all the rules, but there are rules. There's a deep structure.
That's a great bridge between these worlds of thought. And speaking of fundamental principles, the book takes on Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
Oh, yes, a direct challenge.
So Heisenberg says there's a fundamental limit to how precisely we can know certain pairs of properties, like a particle's position and momentum. What's the Vedic take?
The Vedic view, as presented here, says, well, maybe our measurement has limits, but there's nothing inherently uncertain or fuzzy in the universe itself.
So the uncertainty is in our knowledge, not in reality.
Exactly. It quotes Einstein's famous sentiment that randomness or probability in physics really just reflects our own ignorance of the deeper underlying mechanisms. This is a major philosophical split from standard quantum mechanics.
It really is. What are your thoughts on that? Challenging something so foundational to modern physics.
It's bold, certainly. Heisenberg's principle isn't just an idea, it's deeply embedded in the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics and experimentally verified countless times within that framework. The Vedic view insists on an underlying deterministic reality, perhaps hidden from our current view, echoing Einstein's intuition. It reflects a fundamental difference in assumptions about whether reality at its deepest level is inherently probabilistic or ultimately deterministic.
Okay, moving on. Sati Vijnana. Science of creation. What does that encompass?
It's described as the systematic knowledge of everything about the cosmos, its materials, how they behave, their properties. It includes all material sciences, cosmology. Physics is seen as the root.
But there's a catch.
Yes. The book insists that Sai Vijnana, the science of creation, is incomplete without spiritual science.
Again, that integration. You can't fully understand the material without understanding the non-material, the spiritual or conscious aspect.
Precisely. It's a recurring theme. The material and spiritual are seen as inseparable for a true understanding.
The book then talks briefly about the history, mentioning ancient Indian texts having extensive discussions on this.
Yeah, contrasting this long tradition, supposedly, with modern science's more recent exploration of the universe, it points out that even now, modern cosmology doesn't have universally accepted theories for everything.
And it loops back to that idea of harm, doesn't it?
It does. It asks if our modern technology, based on what it calls partial knowledge, can be harmful, then why were ancient Vedic technologies, presumably based on a complete understanding, considered harmless?
That's a really provocative question. It makes you think about the relationship between the depth of understanding and the ethical application of knowledge. Are inherently safer technologies possible if derived from a more holistic science?
It's a fascinating hypothetical, framed as a historical reality in this text. It challenges our assumptions about progress and the nature of technology itself.
Okay, let's get down to the absolute basics according to this view, the fundamental components of the world.
Right. It reiterates two factors. Upadana Karan, the material cause.
The stuff things are made of.
Yes. And Nimitta Karan, the conscious entities, the makers or agents.
And the ultimate material cause, the primordial stuff.
That's Preki. Described as jada padartha, inert, non-living material. It's the most subtle, the absolute initial state before anything else forms.
And everything comes from this Preti.
Everything. Stars, planets, particles, us. Everything arises from it, exists within it, and eventually dissolves back into it. It's the ultimate substratum.
And the book makes a point about modern science here.
Yeah, it notes that modern science doesn't really have a final answer yet for what things like quarks or electrons are fundamentally made of,
Yeah.
implying Preki is that deeper answer.
Okay. Does it describe Preti in more detail? What are its features?
It does. It lists quite a few specific characteristics.
Like what?
Eternal existence, it always was, always will be. Uncreated and indestructible.
Can't be made or destroyed.
Right. Before creation, it's uniformly spread out everywhere. It's inherently inactive, no motion within it initially. It's the subtle source of all non-living things.
It holds everything.
Yes, it contains everything within it. And interestingly, it exists in a state described as darkness, unlike other states of matter we know.
Darkness, like literally dark.
It seems to suggest a state preceding light or any form of energy we perceive, a primordial stillness and potential. And crucially, it's said to be unknowable by our current scientific methods. Too subtle.
That's a pretty comprehensive picture of something fundamentally elusive.
It is. It's the ultimate ground state, beyond our direct grasp, but the source of everything graspable.
And within this Preki, there are the gunas.
Yes, 3 fundamental qualities or tendencies inherent in Prakriti: sattva, rajasa, and tamas.
Okay, break those down for us. Sattva.
Sattva is described as illuminating, light, knowledge, harmony, bonding things together.
Rajasa.
Rajasa is about activity, motion, passion, repulsion, initiating change.
And tamas.
Tamas is darkness, inertia, heaviness, obstruction, ignorance, think gravity, resistance.
And these aren't separate things, are they?
No, absolutely not. The book stresses they are interconnected, always interacting like 3 strands of a rope. Their dynamic balance and imbalance is what drives all the diversity and activity in the universe.
And the book draws analogies to modern physics.
It does. It suggests, perhaps loosely, that you could see sattva as related to maybe illumination or bonding principles, rajasa related to force or activity, and tamas related to mass or inertia.
So trying to map these ancient concepts onto modern terms.
It seems like an attempt to bridge the gap, yeah, to provide some familiar reference points for understanding the influence of these gushas.
Okay, next up, Kala. Time. This is always a big one.
A very big one. The book mentions Vedic units of time, often vast cyclical ages.
Yugas and kalpas and that kind of thing.
Exactly, and it contrasts this with modern science's view, acknowledging relativity's idea that time isn't absolute, it can stretch and shrink.
But then it brings in ancient sages, Maharshi Kanda and Yaska. What was their perspective?
They viewed kala not just as duration, but as a kind of functional yet inactive substance.
A substance. Time as a substance.
Yeah, possessing properties like induction and mobility, but fundamentally inactive itself. It's differentiated from time as just what a clock measures.
That's a very different concept.
Yeah.
And where does Kala come from in this Vedic picture?
It's described as the very first thing created after the supreme conscious entity forms the desire to create. It's like the framework laid down for creation to unfold within.
How does that square with modern physics, where time is woven into space-time with space?
It's quite different. Modern physics treats time as a dimension intrinsically linked with space, influenced by gravity and motion, as described by relativity. There's no concept of time as a separate substance created by consciousness in that framework. The Vedic Kala is a more metaphysical entity, the very condition for cosmic processes initiated by a conscious will.
Okay. After Kala, what's the next step in creation, according to the book?
Manastattva. This is described as the first gross material that forms.
Gross. Meaning not quite so subtle anymore.
Relatively speaking, yes. It arises from the initial vibrations that Kala initiates within Prakti.
And what is Manastattva?
It's described as a subtle, pervasive, invisible material. It has imperceptible energy. It's the foundation upon which further, more complex creation is built.
So a kind of intermediary stage between the absolute subtle Praki and more recognizable matter.
That seems to be the idea. And the supreme conscious entity interacts with this Manastattva too, through something called Om Rashmi. This Om Rashmi initiates vibrations within Manastattva.
Okay, Rashmi again. This seems like a key term, like rays or vibrations.
Exactly, subtle vibrations or energies. And the book uses that analogy of throwing stones in a pond.
Right, you mentioned that. How does it apply here?
To show that these vibrations, these Rashmis, can coexist and overlap in Manastattva, but they retain their independent nature, like ripples crossing each other without destroying each other. It allows for complexity to build.
I see. And these Rashmis are the building blocks for particles.
Yes. The book says elementary particles and quanta actually originate from the compaction of Vedic mantras, specifically Pishanti Vak, that second, subtle stage of sound vibration we talked about.
So subtle sound compacting into particles? That's wild. What kinds of Rashmis are there?
We're introduced to Chanda Rashmis. These are described as the source of light.
Okay, a light Rashmi.
They could apparently engulf particles, produce forces, and act similarly to another type, Pra-Rashmis.
Prak. That usually means life force, doesn't it?
It often does, but here it seems broader. Pra-Rashmis are described as super subtle vibrations responsible for fundamental interactions.
Like what?
Attraction that's specifically called prak, repulsion apana, linking things together vyana, maintaining balance samana, even an upward force udana.
Wow, a whole set of forces attributed to these subtle vibrations.
And there are even subprachas mentioned like naga, kurma, kakala, devadatta. It's a very detailed system of fundamental vibrational forces. How does this compare to modern physics for fundamental forces?
Well, modern physics has gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. This Vedic picture seems much more complex, with specific Rashmis for attraction, repulsion, linking, balance. It's a very different taxonomy of fundamental interactions.
It really is. It's attributing these fundamental physical behaviors to specific types of subtle vibrations originating from consciousness and mantras.
Okay, so we have Preki, Kala, Manastattva, and these Rashmis. What about space? Where does everything happen?
That's Akatattva, space. It's defined as a subtle, all-pervading material that behaves like a void or hollowness.
A material that behaves like a void. That sounds contradictory.
It does, doesn't it? Maybe think of it as the potential for voidness, the capacity to contain things. It's said to contain various Rashmis, Triyap, Marut, Stratmavayu, Chanda Rashmis.
So space isn't empty in this view. It's filled with dormant Rashmis.
Exactly. Maharshi Kannada is quoted defining akashas as where substances enter and exit. The Rashmis within it are mostly dormant, which allows particles and radiation to move freely through it.
But not entirely passive.
Apparently not. Some Rashmis within Akasha are said to provide a kind of reactionary force, actually helping things move.
How does this Vedic Akasha compare to the modern scientific view of space or space-time?
Well, modern physics, particularly since Einstein, doesn't see space as a substance, but as part of the dynamic fabric of space-time, which can be warped by mass and energy. It's the geometric stage on which physics plays out. Vedic Akasha sounds more like a subtle, pervasive medium filled with latent energies or vibrations that can influence motion. It's less geometric and more substantial, perhaps, even if subtly so.
Okay. Let's talk about Bala forces. How are they defined generally?
As the property that holds matter together and nurtures it, makes it mobile.
And how many forces does Vedic science recognize?
9. It lists 9 distinct types of forces.
9. Wow. Can you name a few?
Sure. There's Antaryamal, Androvyava, Maitravarun, Arshina, Sukra, Mentha, and others like Rukna, Pranjajanya, and Naryantha, each supposedly with specific functions.
That's way more than the 4 fundamental forces of modern physics.
It really is. It suggests a potentially more nuanced classification of interactions, or perhaps it groups phenomena differently than modern science does. Without detailed descriptions of each, it's hard to directly compare, but the number itself is striking.
Let's zoom in on one. Gravity. How does Vedic physics explain gravity?
It brings back Maharshi Kayada, who suggested things fall due to gravity when there's an absence of something called saskara.
Saskara, like an inherent property resisting the fall.
Something like that, perhaps inertia or an inherent tendency, but then it gets into the mechanism, talking about gravitons.
Wait, Vedic physics talks about gravitons. Isn't that a modern concept?
It uses the term but describes them very differently. Here, gravitons aren't fundamental. They are formed by combining specific Chanda Rashmis, Pakti and Pahati, with other Rashmis, Stratma Vayu, Musa, Utu, that contain the Rashmi.
Okay, that's complex. A composite particle made of specific vibrations. And how did these Vedic gravitons cause gravity?
By absorbing certain Rashmis, Bhati and Pokti, from other objects, this absorption process is what creates the attractive force.
Absorption causes attraction. Interesting. And this explains why gravity is weak, but long range.
That's the claim, because the absorption mechanism is subtle but involves pervasive Rashmis. How does this compare to modern ideas about gravity, the hypothetical graviton, and maybe the Higgs boson?
It's really different. Modern physics theorizes the graviton as the fundamental force carrier for gravity in quantum field theory, though we haven't detected it. General relativity describes gravity as space-time curvature caused by mass energy. The Higgs boson gives particles mass by interacting with the Higgs field, and mass causes gravity, but the Higgs isn't the mediator of gravity. This Vedic idea of composite gravitons absorbing Rashmis to cause attraction is a totally different mechanism than particle exchange or space-time curvature.
A fundamentally different picture, yeah.
What about charge, electric charge? How does Vedic science handle that?
Charge is seen as a property of material. Electricity, or vidyut, is what provides activity and heat.
And positive and negative charges.
They're explained by an excess of certain Rashmis. Positively charged particles have too many Putta, or Marut Rashmis.
Okay.
Negatively charged particles have an excess of Viti Rashmis, specifically named Bhuvah, Svah.
So charge is an imbalance of specific, subtle energies.
Seems so. And attraction and repulsion happen because of how these excess Rashmis interact with each other and with something called Asura energy.
Asura energy, we'll have to come back to that. But the mechanism is Rashmi interaction, not photon exchange, like in QED.
Correct. It's framed as interactions between these inherent vibrational imbalances rather than the exchange of virtual force-carrying particles like photons in modern quantum electrodynamics.
Okay, now the big one. Formation of quanta and elementary particles. Where do they come from in this Vedic story?
They appear relatively late in the creation sequence, apparently the 10th step. They originate from something called Vayu Tattva.
Vayu Tattva, like air element.
It's described here more like vacuum energy, a mixture of Preta and Chanda Rashmis.
So particles arise from vacuum energy, which is made of these fundamental vibrations. How does it happen?
There's a 5-step process outlined. It involves the Rashmi, interactions between Pracha and Apana, attraction-repulsion Rashmis, the formation of a trika structure involving specific mantras, Gayatri, Treat, Mam, Jagati.
Mantras forming particle structures.
That's the idea. And from this process, various particles emerge. There's even a structural analogy made.
Between particles and trash.
Stars. It suggests particles, like stars, have a core and an outer part rotating at different speeds with different densities of Pracha Rashmis.
That's a fascinating parallel. A kind of fractal structure across scales.
Potentially, yeah. It also mentions an envelope of Stratma Vayu around particles.
What does that do?
It restricts the Pracha Rashmis from escaping, kind of holding the particle together. It discusses photon and lepton formation and says particle rotation is due to Gayatri Rashmis.
And how do particles combine?
Influenced by that Asura energy, dark energy again, and subtle electricity. It also mentions different Rashmis and particles have different speeds.
Faster than light possible.
One specific Rashmi, Dhananjaya Rashmi, is said to have the highest velocity. And it talks about neutrino-like particles having high penetration power.
Why?
Because of Anu Upchanda Rashmis strengthening something called Vakpatva. It's incredibly detailed. How does this compare to the standard model's particle zoo and origins? Well, the standard model identifies fundamental particles, quarks, leptons, bosons, and their interactions via forces mediated by other bosons. It doesn't really offer a step-by-step creation narrative like this Vedic one, which starts from consciousness and vibrations. The Vedic process seems much more, well, procedural and based on these specific Rashmi interactions and mantra structures. The star particle analogy is also unique to this Vedic description. It's a very different way of building up complexity from fundamental principles.
Okay, let's talk energy. How is energy defined?
As that which holds substances together and makes them mobile, its ultimate source is the Om Rashmi and Manas Tattva in non-living things.
And it manifests as these Rashmis.
Yes, later as Prat, Chanda, Marut Rashmis, every particle is seen as a synthesis of these Rashmis.
So energy isn't separate from matter, it's inherent in its structure.
Exactly. Potential energy relates to the configuration of these Rashmis, kinetic energy to their movement.
And sound, you mentioned that earlier.
Yes, sound propagation is described as compressions and rarefactions in these Praja and Chanda Rashmis. And the text suggests this can happen even in a vacuum.
Which directly contradicts modern physics, right?
Yeah.
Sound needs a medium.
It does, unless you consider Akasha filled with these Rashmis as the medium, perhaps. It's an interesting point. Vacuum energy itself is described as a mix of Stramavayu and various Rashmis.
And it introduces Asura Vichi.
Yes, associated with dark energy.
Okay, let's tackle dark matter and dark energy directly then. What is the Vedic perspective using this Asura concept?
Asura Tattva is introduced as material that obstructs combination processes. It keeps things apart.
So it's repulsive.
Essentially, yes. The book acknowledges modern science has identified dark matter and dark energy, but doesn't yet have a full description. The Vedic view proposes Asura Vijaya as playing this role of maintaining distance between particles, counteracting attraction.
Like the cosmological constant or dark energy causing expansion?
Potentially analogous, yes.
Yeah.
Different types of Asura Tattva are mentioned, all repulsive, possibly corresponding to dark matter effects too, by preventing structure formation in certain ways or influencing galactic rotation curves, perhaps.
And it mentioned light speed.
Yes, intriguingly, it suggests the velocity of light might exceed its normal limit under certain conditions, specifically when interacting with Asura dark energy.
That would be revolutionary if true. So the Vedic texts offer this Asura Tattva framework to explain phenomena we currently label as dark matter and dark energy.
That seems to be the interpretation presented. It provides a mechanism repulsion, obstruction rooted in its own cosmology, rather than invoking unknown particles or energy fields as modern science currently does while research continues.
Okay, last major concept for now. Mass and its cause. How does the book approach this?
It starts by mentioning the modern concept of mass and the Higgs boson theory.
The Higgs field giving particles mass.
Right. But it also notes there are criticisms and unanswered questions around the Higgs mechanism even within modern physics.
And the Vedic alternative.
Mass, in this view, arises from something called Vaiku Indra.
Vaiku Indra, what's that?
Described as a subtle electric current. This interacts with a very specific combination of Rashmis Prat, Apana, Vyana, Dhananjaya, along with Trey-up Chanda Rashmi, all contained within an outer web of Sritlamavayu.
Okay, that's a lot of components. And this whole complex structure causes mass. How?
By causing resistance to motion, inertia. The more densely packed these Rashmis are in this configuration, the more mass the particle has.
So mass isn't from an external field like Higgs, but an intrinsic property of the particle's internal Rashmi structure and this subtle current.
Exactly. It's an inherent consequence of the particle's composition and internal dynamics in the Vedic view.
And it touches on mass energy equivalence.
Yes. It discusses the relationship between mass, energy, and prat-tattva. It suggests that apparent violations of conservation laws, like mass seemingly appearing or disappearing in nuclear reactions, might just be interconversions between mass and energy mediated by these underlying Prat-Rashmi.
How does this Vedic explanation of mass compare overall to the Higgs mechanism?
They are fundamentally different. The Higgs mechanism relies on an external quantum field pervading space, and particles gain mass through their interaction with this field. The Vedic view describes mass as an intrinsic property arising from the specific internal structure and vibrational dynamics, Rashmis, of the particle itself, involving this Vaikuta Indra current. One is interactional, the other compositional and dynamic.
Throughout this book, Introduction to Vedic Physics, there are these little exercises, questions for the reader.
Yeah, designed to make you stop and think and compare these ideas with modern science.
We thought it'd be good to throw a few of those out to you, our listener, to chew on. For instance, one asks, Try to understand how our ears convert sound waves into an electrical signal. What happens to these signals after reaching the brain?
It prompts thinking about the mechanics of perception, maybe considering both the known biology and perhaps if there's a Vedic Rashmi-based layer to it too.
Exactly. And then there's one about time. What is time? What does modern science say about it? Gather as much information as you can. And compare it with the Kala, as explained in the Vedic physics.
That's a direct invitation for comparative study. Based on our chat, what are the immediate differences that jump out for you between modern time and Vedic Kala?
Well, the modern view seems focused on time as a dimension, relative, linked to space, measurable by clocks. The Vedic Kala sounds more like a fundamental created substance, maybe even a field, linked to consciousness, setting the stage for events. Very different feel.
Agreed. Here's another about space. How do subtle particles, waves, and all other substances travel unhindered in Akasha substance?
Right. If Akash is this subtle material full of dormant Rashmis, how does stuff move through it so freely? It's a good question about the properties of this Vedic space.
It makes you ponder the nature of that dormancy of the Rashmis within it. Then there's one on energy. Explain the mechanism of energy generation from particle-antiparticle combination.
Comparing eco-co and matter-antimatter annihilation with whatever the Vedic explanation might be, presumably involving Rashmi interactions again.
One would assume so. It pushes you to see if the Vedic framework can account for such high energy phenomena. Then, getting more critical. With reasoning, critically analyze the Higgs boson.
Ooh, directly taking on a pillar of the standard model. From a Vedic perspective, what kind of critique might arise? What aspects might they question?
Well, given the Vedic focus on consciousness and fundamental vibrations, they might question if the Higgs field is truly fundamental or if it's an emergent phenomenon arising from deeper Rashmi dynamics. They might ask if it adequately explains mass without invoking consciousness or these subtle energies. The Vedic explanation based on internal Rashmi structure offers a completely different foundation, so the critique would likely stem from that contrasting viewpoint.
And finally, one on light. Explain the dual nature of light from modern science and Vedic science perspectives.
Wave-particle duality. Modern physics describes it using quantum mechanics. Vedic science, with its Chandrarashmis being the source of light but also having particle-like interactions, presumably offers its own explanation based on those Rashmi properties. Comparing those explanations would be fascinating.
These questions really do push for a deeper engagement, don't they? Not just passively receiving the information, but actively comparing and contrasting. For you, the learner, listening now, what thoughts are bubbling up? We'd genuinely love to see your perspectives in the comments.
It also reinforces that core difference we mentioned early on, the focus on why and for whom, not just how.
And contemplating that idea of a supreme conscious entity as the source and guide of the cosmos. That's a radically different framework than purely materialistic science.
It offers a very different sense of meaning and purpose within the universe.
Now, if this discussion has piqued your interest and you want to go deeper, remember this book we've been discussing is a summary.
Right. The original, much more detailed work is Acharya Agnivrat Naistik's Vaid Vigyan Alok. That's where the really exhaustive exploration lies.
So this introduction is like cracking the door open.
A valuable doorway into a complex and ancient system of thought.
Okay, so let's try to summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive. We've journeyed through the Vedic perspective on physics, exploring core ideas like Guy.
The Vedic Rashmi theory. The idea of vibrations originating from consciousness. Prati as the fundamental matter, with its three guta sattva, rajasa, tados.
We looked at their unique concepts of Kala time and Akasha space as subtle substances or fields. The classification of 9 fundamental forces differing from modern physics 4.
Specific Rashmi-based explanations for gravity and electric charge. A detailed, step-by-step account of how particles and quanta form from vacuum energy, Vayatattva, and mantra structures.
A view of energy rooted in Rashmis, potential explanations for dark matter and dark energy via Asura Tattva, and a completely different mechanism for the origin of mass involving internal Rashmi structures and the Vaikuka Indra current.
And throughout, we've noted the contrasts and occasional parallels with modern scientific understanding. The emphasis on consciousness, the 3 causes, material, instrumental, helping, and the ethical dimension woven into the definition of science are really defining features of this Vedic approach.
Which leads us to our final thought for you, our listener. Take a moment and consider this. What might be the potential benefits, but also the challenges of trying to integrate a more holistic understanding, one that seriously considers the why and for whom, alongside the how, into our scientific work and technological development.
How might incorporating purpose, ethics, maybe even consciousness reshape how we tackle huge global challenges? Things like climate change, resource management, AI development. How might it change our view of our own place in the cosmos?
It's a big question, asking us to think about the very nature and goals of our quest for knowledge. Something to mull over.
Definitely food for thought.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of Vedic physics. We hope it's given you some new perspectives to consider.
It's certainly been an interesting journey exploring these ideas.
Please like, share, comment, and subscribe to WizVibe YouTube channel for more interesting talk shows.